Welcome to Let's Talk with Hart Hagan, and today I'm joined by Lonnie Griesbaum and Rolf Friis. Lonnie and Rolf, how y'all doing today?
Doing real
Doing great.
well.
So today is July 4th, and we're going to talk about empire. And in American culture, a curious thing is that if you say anything against empire, you're thought to be anti-American, as if America is our empire, or as if the empire is what America is. But I think of the movie Forrest Gump, where Bubba dies on the beach or on the riverbed, and he says, "Forrest, why did this happen? They're fighting in Vietnam." And Bubba says, "Forrest, why did this happen?" And so that I'm on Bubba's side. When it comes to empire, I'm on Bubba's side. I'm absolutely not on the side of people who want to send Bubba to Vietnam and get him killed because of some twisted agenda or to enrich this or that corporation. What do y'all think about that?
You want me to
You
go
don't have to
first?
agree with me. I mean,
Well, I think first you've got to decide what is empire. What has that meant in the past? I mean, we had a Roman Empire, we had a Babylonian Empire, we had the British Empire, which went into decline after we broke away from Britain. There've always been empires, and these empires always had redeeming values, some things that were very positive about them, like in the Roman Empire. They built great aqueducts and architecture, and there were artistic wonders, and there were advances in medicine of their time. But these empires also had lots of qualities that were a lot less than redeeming. Usually those involve the same things we're looking at now. We're looking at unnecessary wars, reaching too far out, trying to control people in faraway lands, hierarchy, people that wanted to oppress others. So I don't see why we should think the American empire should be any different. I mean, we meet all of those traits, I think.
I'm going to read a quote and get your all's comment on it. So this quote is by Arnold Schumpeter. How do you pronounce that, Lonnie?
Schumpeter.
Schumpeter. Okay, so it's a quote about Rome, but it is, see if it sounds familiar. Whenever you hear Rome, think of America and you'll get the right idea. It's the point I'm trying to drive home. So Arnold or Joseph Schumpeter, who was an economist, Austrian economist in the 20th century, he was rather conservative, but he could look objectively at Rome and say the following. It says, "Rome pursued that policy which pretends to aspire to peace, but which unerringly generates war." Sound familiar? The policy of continual preparation for war, the policy of meddlesome interventionism. There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies. If Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that had been insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. That means, like, if it's defense, self-defense is legal, aggression is not. So the fight was always invested with an aura of legality. And it says Rome was always being attacked by neighbors, always fighting for breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. They were enemies who only waited to fall upon the Roman people. Maybe I'm the only. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and again, that's not to say that there weren't advances made in a lot of areas during the Roman Empire. I mean, but interestingly, most of those advances were made by pretty much regular people that had become artists and tradesmen and that sort of thing.
Right.
So I'm sure the Roman people, for the most part, were wonderful people. And I would say that's true here in the United States. Most of the people I meet, regardless of their political background, are wonderful people. They're kind and loving. But something happens when it gets to the government level and you have certain individuals trying to oppress others for their own well-being. Something happens to that. And what the government seems to have to do in that case is do what Orwell's talking about. You have to start inventing reasons why you need to do this or to do that, whether it's to honor the flag or to honor our veterans or to honor this or that. Anything you can do to cover up the dark underbelly of what you're really trying to do. They'll hide bad, let's put it this way. They'll hide bad motives under thinly veiled good motives. In other words, they'll make it look like a good thing that we're going to help these people in Vietnam. We're going to go save them from communism. We're going to and help them have democracy, which is certainly not what was the intent.
So what you're talking about is humanitarian intervention. Rolf, is there any such thing as humanitarian intervention?
Well, sure, there could be. That's not what we do. But yeah, I mean, the potential for that. And if something was truly humanitarian, I would support that. But I don't support, what we do in terms of, and the quote really kind of shines a light on that. I look at the parallels between the Roman Empire and the U.S. Empire today, and it's really striking how many similarities they are, from the vast expansion that just seems to never end, and as we stretch ourselves as far as we can and kind of ignore the problems at home. As you say, the constant production of a new enemy, be it somebody in the Middle East to Russia for 3 years to now we're doing China, that these are not countries that we want to go to war with. There's no good ending to that.
Even Canada, we're even starting to throw shade at Canada,
Yeah, there's literally no end to it.
Rolf, why don't we want to go to war with Russia or China? I mean, we could win those wars.
Yeah, what cost though, and for what benefit? What do we get out of that? So we go to war with Russia or we go to war with China. We're in a war for however many years. I mean, we're looking at years-long war there, and then we defeat them. Then what? What happens? Then we just now we're adding military bases in Russia, military bases in China. We're stealing their resources. Their people are suffering there because of that. What does that help anybody? We need to, in our empire, we need to, fix what's in our own house. We need to provide health care for people and housing for people and better paying jobs. We don't need to be focusing on people across the planet and basically going to war with them to take their resources or just for the control aspect. So every time, I can't remember the quote exactly, but basically every time we build a new plane, a new warship, that's another family going unhoused, another child going hungry. So we need to put the priorities where they lie. We don't even know how many bases we have around the world. Every report I see is a different number. I see 700, 900. I see reports of over 1,000. I know that nobody in Congress can actually tell you how many bases we have. We don't even know. We're so thin. So it all ties together, the domestic with the foreign policy, and that foreign policy is really at the top of the heap because that's where the military industrial cycle just keeps going and going, and it's not going to stop. We can't get out of Afghanistan for anything. We've got both parties now trying to keep us in Afghanistan, and we went to Afghanistan. We didn't even know who the enemy was. We literally, in the Afghanistan papers, it showed that we did not know who we were even fighting there, and now we have to argue to stay there against an enemy we don't even know who they are almost 20 years later. So, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at those parallels with Rome, with their constant expansion, their constant wars, and we see how that went. There is no more Roman Empire, and that's where we're heading, if we stay on this trajectory.
Let me read that quote you were referring to. This is by Eisenhower. At some point during his presidency, was from 1953 to 1961. It was in about the mid 50s, probably, when he had this speech. He says, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron."
And Eisenhower was a brilliant man, and when he left office, he warned us of the military-industrial complex, and what he warned us is exactly what has taken place. So he was spot on and ahead of his time.
And not to mention that domestically, he started one of the biggest infrastructure socialist projects ever undertaken in this country, maybe second only to the railroad system. And that was the interstate highway system. I mean, that's there because that's what Eisenhower wanted. I mean, you could say, well, that's partly what has led to all the cars and pollution, but the idea being he was not opposed to social projects for people here at home. He was not against that at all.
So let me read this quote. I think this quote points to a kind of, I feel that empire is supported by a kind of paranoid delusions about people out to attack you. At least, anyway, let me just read this. It's called the Hoover Report. And Hoover, I can only guess, was J. Edgar Hoover. It doesn't sound like President Herbert Hoover, who would have been a former president at the time. But it says, "It is now clear we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination." So they're talking about communism in the Soviet Union and in Russia, and they're trying to make it sound like that we should be afraid of this enemy whose avowed objective is world domination. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto accepted norms of human conduct do not apply. If the United States is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by force, by more clever, more sophisticated, more effective methods than those used against us. So in other words, the end justifies the means. They are bent on world domination, and the only way we can win is to play dirtier than they do.
You remember the domino theory?
And I say that was the paranoia that I just expressed here was never justified. We were always the primary aggressor in the Cold War. So you talk about the domino theory.
Right. Here's what I want to say about that. I was told all through high school, coming up to graduating and facing going to Vietnam, the standard belief amongst just about everybody I talked to was, if we let the communists have Vietnam, it'll be one country after the other, one country after the other. So here we are, 50 some odd years later. Vietnam has never fell to China. It's never fell to China. In fact, they have trouble getting along with China. They don't particularly care for China intervention in any of their business. And what's happening now? Good chance this shirt was made in Vietnam. Vietnam has their own stock market. Now, this all happened after we left Vietnam and lost, you know. So this domino theory was just malarkey.
Okay,
And
so
it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen.
Walter Lippmann said that to think that if Vietnam falls, America is next. He said that's an insult to the United States Navy.
Right. Right. You know, but look around there. I mean, is Thailand, is it part of a communist China now? No. You know,
ironically,
there's
with
plenty
the
of
domino,
other ones.
yeah.
Rolf.
Yeah, ironically, with the domino theory, you know, if you let the United States expand the empire in one part of the world, next thing you know, we'll be expanding the empire in another part of the world, and then another part of the world. So
it
yeah.
was what they call it projection.
Misdirection.
We were projecting we were projecting what we were going to do onto them. So,
yeah.
So
Propaganda tends to do that a lot. You know,
Right.
accuse the others of what you're doing yourself.
Right.
It's a rich man's game. So here's talk about the domino theory. Here's another way of expressing another metaphor for expressing the same thing. It's kind of like a virus or a plague. So Henry Kissinger knew that the domino theory wouldn't be credible if you said Chile, if we let Chile fall, then Italy is going to be next. So it had to be, but a virus can fly across the, dominoes can't fall across the ocean, but a virus, now we got that. So Henry Kissinger, in a 1970 memo to President Nixon, he wrote this: example of a successful elected Marxist government in Chile would surely have an impact on and even precedent value for other parts of the world, especially in Italy. The imitative spread of similar phenomena elsewhere would in turn significantly affect the world balance and our position in it. In other words, we can't let the Chileans elect their own government. We have to be on that so they won't elect a government that's contrary to the government we think they should have. Otherwise, who knows? Italy could elect a government that's contrary to what we think they should have.
So we go down there and we assassinate one of the top generals, General Schneider. And we do it with guns that it just came out a couple of years ago on some finally unclassified documents, that guns that were supplied covertly by the United States. And Allende had no intentions, we know this today, he had no intentions of forming close ties with Russia. His was a homegrown variety of Marxism that was all totally based on the ownership of the country's rich resources by the people instead of Anaconda aluminum. And so, but what they do in government is they have to create this plausible deniability. So when something happens down there, like it looked at the time like Allende was overthrown by people there in Chile. And then the government has it set up to where they can do this plausible deniability. It's plausible that we had nothing to do with it. Until 40 years later, when finally somebody finds a classified document that proves otherwise, that we actually were behind it for all the wrong reasons. I tell you what, I want to recommend a great book about Kissinger. It's called The Trial of Henry Kissinger by Christopher Hitchens. It's probably available pretty reasonably in paperback, and probably download it. It's a fantastic book, well documented, well referenced. I highly recommend it. There's no reason that Henry Kissinger should be walking around a free man today.
Right. So let me read this So people think that the U.S. is always defending itself. The U.S. and we're always defending ourselves and our allies against foreign aggression. And there's this thing called the Black Book of Communism, which is a piece of work. I mean, it inflates the, anyway, that's a whole different conversation. If anybody's interested in that, it's easy to find videos that refute this Black Book of Communism. For one thing, if you say, oh, communism versus capitalism, how about none of the above? You know, why should I have to choose? I mean, you made that up. That's your ideology, is to say that there's two choices, it's a binary choice, capitalism or communism. That's not my problem. Your ideology is not my problem. But let's look at the U.S. foreign policy body count. Vietnam, I have about 10 different items here, just for starters. Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, 3 million people conservatively, probably closer to 5 million. Iraq War, 2003 to the present, about 1 million people, conservatively 200,000, but probably higher than that. Iraq, the sanctions that we had on Iraq from the 90s into the 2000s, well, just during the 90s, it's probably 1 million people, 500,000 of whom were children. Even if it's a fourth that, what business do we have doing this? In Indonesia in the 60s, I have a figure of 1 million here that could be a bit high, but 500,000 is a conservative figure as far as the number of people. We orchestrated this killing in Indonesia in the 60s because people were supposedly well, it was also democracy. So apparently people aren't allowed to elect their own communist government. Guatemala, from the 50s to the 90s, 200,000 people died because of us, because of a civil war we orchestrated, and we stayed on the wrong side of a civil war. Afghanistan, probably 200,000 people. El Salvador, 100,000 people in the 70s and to the 90s. Argentina, 100,000 people. Nicaragua, 50,000 in the 80s. Chile, in the 1970s, 30,000, just thousands and thousands of people.
Well, in Chile,
Chile,
there's even more than that, because there were all these people that were disappeared, that just disappeared from the face of the earth. In fact, some of the families of those Chileans that were disappeared have filed numerous lawsuits against the United States, trying to collect damages for, you know, they've never found these people. And it's estimated to be in the thousands that were just disappeared.
Well, Rolf, why does this happen? And what can we do to change it?
This happens because we have set up a system with the military industrial complex that's become way too powerful, and there's the profit motive behind it. So for them to have that profit, there has to constantly be war, because without war, they can't manufacture war machines. So it's not even about winning and losing for the most time, as we see in Afghanistan. It's just about perpetual warfare, just never ending, you know. And if for some reason it does have to end, you find a new enemy. And, you know, we're not doing these things for altruistic reasons. And I know that because you can look around the world and see what we aren't involved in. So you can look at things such as Boko Haram, which is an Al-Qaeda offshoot in Africa that deals in human trafficking. Well, if we're going to be humanitarians, why aren't we doing anything about Boko Haram? Well, they're operating in an area where there's no oil and no resources. So
Right.
What does that benefit our military industrial complex to go in there and save actual people who are suffering? We can look at Myanmar, what's going on with the genocide there. We're not doing anything about that. We have the worst genocide in Yemen that's being done by Saudi Arabia, and we're helping to support Saudi Arabia with weapon sales and other infrastructure there. So, you know, or you can look at what we did in Libya, and now after we've been in Libya, they have open air slave markets. So are we going to go back to Libya and do anything about that? We're not, you know, because we already did what we had to do. And oh, well, they have slave markets now, no big deal. You know, that doesn't affect our bottom line in the military industrial complex. So we know we're not doing anything for altruistic reasons. There's too many things going on in the world that we aren't doing anything about. It has to be,
Right.
what is the benefit for us?
Same reason there was never any real effort to do anything about the starvation of all those children in Rwanda.
Yes.
Because Rwanda doesn't have anything we want.
And then when there was a movie about Rwanda, as I recall, the movie just kind of made it look like a strictly ethnic struggle, and didn't say anything about the powers that be behind it that are either orchestrating it or not giving a damn.
Right, right. Anybody remember when Reagan said right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he was so happy because we were going to have this peace dividend. You know, that there was going to be all this money saved because we were finally at peace with Russia. And there was going to be this huge peace dividend, and all the congressmen and senators were talking about how we were going to spend the peace dividend. Well, I don't think that ever happened.
Well, Rolf, why wasn't there a peace dividend?
That's actually something I'm not too sure about. Sorry.
Yeah, it's because the buildup. I mean, to say that there was a peace dividend is to say that the Cold War actually had a real purpose. It didn't have a real purpose. It had a fake purpose. And when the Cold War was over, we invented another war. We invented the war on terror. And all along, we had the war on drugs.
And the war on terror, you know, that's really helpful. It's a really helpful slogan for the military industrial complex because, you know, what is terror? Who is terror and where is terror? Well, that can be anywhere. So terror is how we go from 2 wars in the Middle East to 7, because we're fighting terror. Well, you can say anybody and anywhere is terror. So that just gives us a consistent enemy, because no matter what, no matter where we go, no matter who we fight, we can just say, yeah, that they're terrorists and they're going to hurt the United States.
Plus the word terrorism.
Or
the
even
word
here in our own
terrorism.
country.
Yeah,
know,
right.
You can say people in Kentucky are terrorists, so we're going to start sending troops into Kentucky.
Yeah, and there's no rational definition of the word terrorism that does not put the United States at the very top of the list. Because if you define, by the way, there's a great movie, I forget the name of it. It's Team America World Police. It's by the makers of South Park, but it really tells it properly conveys what actually happens. But anyway, let's see. So I need somebody to tell me a definition of terrorism that applies to, I mean, when you think of terrorists, what do you think of? You think of the little guy. You think of somebody, a suicide bomber. But the state, the big empire, the Death Star is never defined as a terrorist. It's always the, you know, some element of the population or some this or that movement that is characterized as a terrorist. But yeah, I just named, like, when I think of the United States in Vietnam, we're fricking, you know, killing farmers in fields. I mean, they would, by the time they got done, the bodies would be more than the weapons. And when the bodies are more than the weapons, you know, you're slaughtering innocent civilians who don't have weapons. You're slaughtering farmers in the field. And I'm not saying the soldiers were bad people. I'm saying, what if you get drafted, what choice do you have but to go?
Yeah, if your job was to fire the napalm bombs at the villages, I mean, that was what you were trained to do. You know, I mean, you know, it's sad. It's really sad, but that's the fact.
Here's somebody that's quoted. I don't know who this author is, but he's quoted by Michael Parenti. And it says, the Iraqis have lost everything. The people of that unhappy land have lost everything. Let's talk about, you know, after the Iraq War, after the major part of the Iraq War in the early 2000s, the people of that unhappy land have lost everything. Their homes, their schools, their electricity, their clean water, their environment, their neighborhoods, their mosques, their archaeology, their jobs, their careers, their professionals, their state-run enterprises, their physical health, their mental health, their health care, their welfare state, their women's rights, their religious tolerance, their safety, their security, their children, their parents, their past, their present, their future, their lives. More than half the population is either dead, wounded, traumatized, in prison, internally displaced, or in foreign exile. The air, soil, water, blood, and genes drenched with depleted uranium are bringing the most awful birth defects. A river of blood runs alongside the Euphrates and Tigris through a country that may never be put back together again.
Well, and the truth is, Iraq was put together in the first place by empire, by the United States and Britain and France. They put together three totally separate countries and jammed them together and called it Iraq, and then it was ruled as a British protectorate for a while after World War I. So, you know, we put it together and then it breaks, and, you know, who's going to fix it? You know, it's, that wasn't the only bad thing that came out of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is the main reason we had World War II, but that's another conversation.
Rolf?
I don't have anything to add to that. He nailed it. So.
Okay, I have another quote. I have another quote for you. The nationalist not only does not disapprove, this is George Orwell, and it reminds me of trying to talk to people who have just been trained and indoctrinated in the American way and have never been taught to think another way, who equate militarism with America. It's like America is militarism, and if you say anything bad about our foreign wars and our military adventurism, you're anti-American. It reminds me, so George Orwell was not an American, and he was talking 70 years ago, but he says, the nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. So the nationalist doesn't even hear. It's like it's a completely closed mind. And if you try to say something that says the Vietnam War was immoral or the Iraq War was immoral, or it's immoral for us to go all across the global South and Latin America doing things that were not taught about in our history, at least, you know, they might touch upon it in a history class, but you know, if you challenge any of that, then you're anti-American, as if being American means militaristic. If you're not supporting militarism, you're anti-American.
Yeah, it's amazing the years and years of propaganda that have gone into this. Everything from flyover air shows at sporting events, you know, to the various holidays, to just, you know, everything. The way they do their commercials on TV. It's just years of propaganda to, you know, but that's not who we are. You know, that's not what America was founded on. And that's not really what the people here care about, you know? So I wouldn't say that's America. And I would also say that pointing out an issue in your country, be it imperialism or homelessness or whatever, you know, that's not an insult to America. That's love for America. I see this issue. I love my country. I want to fix this issue. I don't find that issue acceptable in the country that I love. So when you point out imperialism, that is definitely not anti-America. I believe that's a love for America, because this imperialism is really keeping the domestic part of America, you know, the people here, from really achieving what we can achieve, because there's too much investment in this military industrial complex. So yeah, I would say it is actually patriotic to point these kinds of things out.
You know, think about it. Any good businessman periodically needs to take a good, honest assessment of his inventory. You know, what am I all about? What's my stock in trade? Because if you don't, eventually you're going to roll off in the ditch. And why shouldn't a country do that too? Periodically, a nation needs to take a personal inventory and say, what have we done right? And more importantly, what have we done wrong? How can we make things right again? What should we do to right the ship? And I don't think it's at all unpatriotic for people to take an inventory of their own country, just as they would their own life, and say, what do I need to do better? I don't think that's unpatriotic at all. In fact, I think that's the pinnacle of patriotism.
Right.
Yeah. It's like having a child and your child does something wrong. Now you love your child, so that doesn't mean you're not going to correct them on what they did wrong, because if you correct that child, that doesn't mean you don't love your child. No, you love your child, you see them doing something wrong, so you correct that. And that's the true love of it, you know? You want to see that child excel, and that child's not going to excel if they keep making that one mistake that they just made, so you correct that.
Right.
That's the same with our country. If we're doing a mistake, we need to correct it.
Yeah, no country's ever going to be perfect. I'm not one that believes that there's anything possible like a utopia. In fact, I think sometimes progressives make that mistake as painting things as a utopia. But we can do better. We can always do better, and a little more better, and a little more better after that. The thing that bothers me is that we're not even heading in that direction anymore. It doesn't seem like to me. It seems like we're moving backwards.
Right. So we're talking about empire, and one element of empire, it's like some people think we don't have an empire because we don't have official colonies. Like the British Empire had colonies, and it was this formal legal relationship. It was understood at the formal legal level that India was a colony of England or of Great Britain. And
you had certain responsibilities too.
Since,
if you were,
well,
you had responsibilities too.
So since we don't have that legal relationship with Mexico or with Latin America or with Puerto Rico, it's like, oh, we're not an empire. But a strong element of empire today is our trade deals, our trade relationships. And these, I tell you, there's never been an empire if it's not the WTO, the World Trade Organization. They absolutely, eliminate much of our sovereignty. But that's another conversation. But here's something going back to Woodrow Wilson's time that says, since trade ignores national, this is Woodrow Wilson, supposedly the idealist, he is supposedly associated with peace. But here's what Woodrow Wilson had to say. Since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. In other words, you think you're sovereign, we got another thing coming. So he says, colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. So when we're using a country economically, we're after their natural resources, we're after their labor, and we want to control their markets. So that goes way back, and that's the trade aspect. Empire is not just a military thing, it's where we use our economic power to impose our will on every country in the world that is weaker than we are, and that's all but about 9 countries.
Well, at least back when England had India as a colony, it also had some responsibilities there. Now, if you do economic imperialism, you don't have to take over a country anymore. As long as you've got a puppet in there that'll do your bidding, you pay off a few rich guys and you get what you want. And then when things go south, they have a natural disaster or something like that strikes, or they get invaded by some troops from a country from the south of them, or whatever bad happens. You have no responsibilities to go in there and help those people. When it was a formal arrangement, you did have some responsibility. It probably wasn't a lot, but so you're really off the hook now. If you got
So let me ask you about something. George W. Bush said America is the greatest force for good the world has ever seen. What do you think about that, Rolf?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago with, we see a lot of humanitarian issues around the world and we're not touching them because it doesn't benefit us economically. And as far as where we are going, we've been in the Middle East for, well, longer, but, with like Afghanistan, 20 years, what kind of good is coming out of that? What have we achieved there that's so good? The people of Afghanistan aren't happy with us there. So they don't feel like that good has been spread. So what did we achieve? And you look a lot of these coups that we've pulled in Bolivia recently, for example, and they already have buyer's remorse. It's a hot mess down there in Bolivia now since our new coup leader's down there. And this happens again. We talked about Chile, with Pinochet, and that man was a maniac, but he worked with our government and our military industrial complex. So that was preferable to a non-maniac who wouldn't work with us at the same rate. So I don't know how much good comes from that. I'm sure there have been moments of good, but I don't know that that's outweighed the bad that we've done through all this imperialism around the world. And these countries, they don't really want us there, and when we go somewhere, we don't leave. We still have bases in Japan. We still have bases in Germany. How long have those bases been there? Why are they still there? What are they being used for?
Right,
So,
Michael, go ahead. Michael Parenti
but,
says the republic pays for the empire. So we're the republic. We're the people. We the people pay for the empire. We pay so that a few rich people can get richer, and the republic pays for the empire. When you have all that empire out there, it's not free. And the people who are making money off of it are not paying for it. They're making us pay for it.
right. It's not just, tax dollars that are paying for it. We're paying for it in watching our infrastructure crumble. We're paying for it with our lives, as, it's mostly the poor that join the military and go and serve. So it's not just the money. We're paying in lots of ways for this.
There have been some isolated instances in the past where I think America has really shown a good thing, good side. But again, usually it has to do with a group of American citizens, not some formal United States project. Groups that go over and actually do try to feed people that are starving, things like that. And you hear that from a lot of foreign countries. Look, we don't hate your people. We hate your government for what your government's doing, but we don't hate you Americans as people.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to hang on to, because look, they're showing us a lot more respect as people than we do them sometimes. I mean, that amazes me.
Yeah, if they watch our media, they've got to know how brainwashed we are.
Yeah, I'm
That's
pretty
true.
sure they do.
Well, here's so we were going to start back in the 1940s, but one of my main points is that we haven't fought a just war since 1945. Technically, World War II was a war of self-defense, and I don't think it should be whitewashed. I think there's a lot of things that we did wrong with respect to World War II, but at least the argument can be made that it was a war of self-defense. But that hasn't happened since 1945. Now, in the late 40s, the United Nations was formed. The United Nations is formed by way of a treaty. That treaty is called the UN Charter, the Charter of the United Nations. And part of the United Nations Charter, by the way, a treaty is the law of the land. And the United Nations Charter says all members, in other words, all member nations, the United States is a member nation, so all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not in danger. So we have a legal obligation to settle our disputes by peaceful means. And then all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. We're not supposed to use force, and we're not supposed to threaten force. And there are provisions, like we could defend ourselves if we're being attacked. We can defend ourselves from an imminent attack, but that wasn't the case in Vietnam. That wasn't the case in Korea. That wasn't the case in Iraq. You could go on and on with our military interventions that had nothing to do with any sort of imminent attack on us. So we break the law 1,000 times before breakfast every day.
Well, you know, the United Nations was a great idea, one that I would have fully supported at the time, but it's pretty much a joke now. I mean, nobody listens to the United Nations. The world is run
But
by three.
Why? Why does no?
I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because the world since then is being run by three groups: the IMF, the World Bank, and the G8. And whether it's the G7 or the G8, it doesn't really make much difference. Those are the organizations that actually run the world through their money and the trade arrangements and all that kind of thing. They are the one that set policy. And it's just like in the European Union, when Juncker said that he wasn't going to let a thing like elections trump economic policy. What does that mean? That means you can elect all the people you want in your country and make all the laws you want, except when it comes to economics, and they're not going to let elections trump economic policy. And that's exactly what's going on now.
Here's what I have to say about that. Show me a real democracy. We've never seen real democracy. Real democracy is where you get to vote on the issues that affect you. And it's like, what? The economy doesn't affect us? If we had real democracy, we would be able to vote on anything related to economics. And if we can't vote on anything related to economics because of ideology or because of the World Trade Organization, then we don't have a real democracy. And here's what I was going to say. So I hear what you're saying about we don't respect the United Nations because you named the World Trade Organization and the World Bank or the International Monetary. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean those are organizations that are controlled by the United States or United States corporations.
Mostly.
So
but you can't forget some of the Western European countries. They're in on it too.
Well, if the United States, if the people of the United States were sovereign, there wouldn't be any wars because the people of the United States should have control over our government. And if we don't, then that suggests that we don't have a democracy. And then, and if we had control over our government, then we wouldn't be doing all this war because the people are not in favor of war when they have all the facts. That's what I say. What do y'all think?
Oh, I agree. Except that we're not a real democracy.
Right.
We're a republic. The way it's set up now.
No, we're not a republic either. That's nonsense.
We vote for representatives. We do not vote unless it's
I think that's a false distinction. I think the republic thing is something that some people bring up for reasons of their own. But there's no material distinction between a democracy and a republic. Both of them ought to be ruled by the people. Whatever we have, whatever you call it, it's not ruled by the people. Because the policy is like, take Medicare for all. And Medicare for all is not a reality. people want something like Medicare for all, but we don't have it.
Well, then why don't we get to vote for it as a ballot initiative? In a real democracy, we would be able to vote for or against that on a ballot. We have to depend on our representatives to get that through.
Like Kyle Kalinski's idea, I don't know if you've seen this, but his thing is we should have five things to vote for, 5 big topics every year that directly to the people. So that could be something like Medicare for all, raising the minimum wage, whatever it is. And then the people, it's put straight to the people, it's put straight on the ballot, and we vote it up and down. And then the next election, we have 5 new issues on the ballot, and so on and so forth. So what do you think about that, Hart?
Yeah, I've heard him talk about it. It sounds pretty persuasive. And I think one thing that he says about it is that if the people do enact something, I mean, it sounds like a great idea. If the people enact something, then legislatures would be reluctant to unenact it. So what do you think about it, Rolf? Tell me more about it.
I think it'd be a great idea. There's always dangers with direct democracy, just in the fact that you got to make sure people are informed.
Right.
Because if people aren't informed, a direct democracy can go bad. But that said, I do like the freedom that it gives people to kind of choose their society and the way that it's going to run, because our representatives aren't really doing that. We let them know what they want, and then they do whatever they want to do anyways. So this definitely opens that up to us, and I would fully support something like that. I would need to see more details on how they kind of pick, what goes on the ballot or whatever. But I think, over time, you would get through most of the issues. So yeah, I would support that.
Let me read you something. We got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Let me, when I think of us meddling all over the world, so for some reason Guatemala comes to mind first, because in Guatemala in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz was a popularly elected leader. FDR was his hero. He wanted to enact a mild agrarian reform, which means redistributing land to people who could use it, taking a little bit of the land, including the land owned by his own family, and distributing that to people who could actually use it to grow food and provide for themselves. And the Dulles brothers got together and said, communism! Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, the CIA director under Eisenhower, and they get together and say, hey, this looks like communism. We can't let that happen. And they overthrew the government. And then you see a video of Richard Nixon in a room with books. And Richard Nixon flies down to Guatemala and said, see this room of books? This is subversive Marxist literature. Okay, why? We're going to control what people read. They can't read. They can only read what we think they ought to read. And but here's something that the State Department, or something Noam Chomsky quoted about that situation. It says, as Washington prepared to overthrow Guatemala's first democratic government in 1954, a State Department official warned that Guatemala had become an increasing threat to the stability of Honduras and El Salvador. Now, stability has a particular meaning there. It means that stability to U.S. corporate interests. So it's agrarian reform, meaning redistributing some of the land. Its agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon. Its broad social program of aiding the workers and peasants in a victorious struggle against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises has a strong appeal to the populations of Central American neighbors, where similar conditions prevail. Stability means security for the upper classes and large foreign enterprises. So stability means United Fruit Company doesn't have anything to worry about. Big corporations don't have anything to worry about, that kind of thing. So that's empire. That's empire, it's propaganda, it's Orwellian.
Oh yeah. They sent 5,000 Marines into Guatemala to make sure they got that railroad built out of the land they took from the peasants, just so they could get the bananas out for National Fruit Company. I mean, and you can find that easily, you know, I mean, it's not like it's hidden.
I know all of us are in agreement here. Why is this so little known is this little known in our culture? If so, why?
You know, those in power control the history that is taught. So they're not going to teach history that's going to lose support for the way of life. So they're going to bring kids up young to believe, they start with things like Pledge of Allegiance and things like that to, form that patriotism in kids early. And then, it just comes with media year after year, day after day with these articles, telling us who our enemies are and telling us how we're spreading freedom and democracy across the world and doing humanity stops with that. So you get that culture ingrained and we've just, I don't know what it's going to take kind of to flip the switch in the population to see what the truth of it is, but that's what we have to work on, because ending the empire is key to us progressing and moving forward. It's absolutely towards the top of the list there.
Well, I hate to think it's a conspiracy, and I don't know how long this has been going on, but I know for the last few decades, textbook companies would write textbooks to get approval from the school boards in Texas or
Right.
And if it didn't make it past the Texas school boards, nobody saw it because they weren't going to make 5 different versions of a textbook.
Right.
So that tells you a lot right there about
Right.
what you're going to get in a textbook.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Let's say any final thoughts on empire. So let me give my final thoughts and then Lonnie and then Rolf. The purpose of this episode has been to kind of think about and talk about how the U.S. is not about spreading freedom and democracy in the world. That's not the effect of our foreign policy. And that I would say that's not the purpose of our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is to support an empire. We need to know that because the empire enslaves all of us.
Well, my closing thought would be, I think we're seeing the beginning of the implosion of our empire here. The reason I say that is I don't think our economic system, which is built on quicksand, can weather the next few years. I think, the stock market's an aberration. It's a playground, it's a casino for the wealthy, but underneath it, there's nothing there. And I think once that crumbles, it's all over, folks. We'll either find a new way to get along with each other and a new way to live and a new way to be a country, or we'll descend into fascism.
Mm-hmm. Rolf?
Yeah, we need to understand that every issue that we have, you can trace it back to the economy, and we're on a war economy right now because of the empire. So it all starts with, breaking up that empire and changing that economy to an economy for the people, not economy for perpetual war. So, people need to share these kind of videos out, share the kind of knowledge out, and make people aware of what this empire is about and what the war economy and the military industrial complex is. Because once we get people informed, they're not going to like what they see. And that's when public outcry can put an end to this, I think.
That's a great place to end. Lonnie Griesbaum, Rolf Friis, thanks so much for joining me today. This is Hart Hagan signing off, and happy 4th of July. Let's make America something that works for everybody and not just the few.